and I'm not an expert in shoreline management or living shorelines, but I know enough to be dangerous. Several years ago, the Center for Watershed Protection had a contract with the Chesapeake Bay to be their sediment and stream restoration coordinator. And as a result of that contract, we were asked to chair and organize several expert panels to try to determine appropriate crediting for different best management practices. And since there is a total maximum daily load in a bay program, everyone had to be on the same page with respect to how many pounds reduction this practice would give and what qualifications were necessary for that practice. So we assembled this expert panel to develop crediting protocols for shoreline management practices. It was initially approved by what's called the Water Quality Goal Team, which is part of the Bay Partnership. It was initially approved on 2015. Some additions were made in 2017 that I will explain, and some corrections to those additions were made in 2019. Excuse me. So just to give you an idea of the process for crediting best management practices, first up, the Bay program ranks different management practices in order of importance and assigns them to the appropriate source sector committee. Shoreline practices were assigned for some reason to the Urban Stormwater Work Group, but there are other committees such as the Wetlands Committee, Agricultural Committee. I'm not sure why this practice was assigned to them. But, so the work group then assembles a panel of experts that's comprised of representatives from academia, local government, state government, federal government, NGOs, practitioners. And then the expert panel uses the literature and most current data and best professional judgment to develop sediment and nutrient reduction credits for the best management practices. It's quite a long process. The expert panel typically takes a year, but then going through the other Bay work group approval processes could take up to an additional 6 months to a year. So the reason that shoreline practices, and really when I talk about shoreline practices, I'm talking about total shoreline practices. The reason that we felt justified to develop separate credits was because
So I'm going to stop you for a second.
Sure.
There seems to be an audio issue, so let's see if I can fix that and fix it real quick.
Okay. Are you hearing feedback or?
Yeah, some people are hearing, some people are not. So I'm trying to get the call-in number out to everyone so they can call in. Call in number 408 418 9388. And then the meeting, the access code is 129-235-9931. All right, and maybe try speaking up just a little bit louder will help too.
Okay.
But I think you are good to go.
Okay. Okay, so the justification for developing credits for tidal shoreline practices was because they were historically lumped together with stream restoration practices, and who knows why. Also, it was generally recognized that shoreline erosion is one of the greatest sources of sediment and turbidity to the Chesapeake Bay, and further nutrients associated with those sediments. And we felt the scientific literature supports development of protocols for estimating shoreline management practices. So Brittany, has the voice issue been resolved?
I haven't gotten any other comments. No, so they're saying they can hear me. You're just breaking up just a little bit. So maybe just try, like I said, like what you're doing, talking a little bit louder.
Yeah, or I can also call in if that would help, if you think.
Yeah, that may help, yes.
Let's see. Did you?
Here, so the call-in number, if anyone needs it, is 1-408-418-9388.
Can you repeat that,
and then,
please? I'm sorry.
Yep, 1-408.
Yep.
418-9388. And the access code is 129-235-9931.
Sorry.
That's all right.
What's the access code?
129-235-9931.
Okay. 129-225.
235.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Everyone, please bear with us. We will get this train moving in a second.
325 or 235?
235. So it's 129-235-9931.
I'm sorry, I'm just not getting through. Try again.
That's all right. I mean, you can just keep going because we can hear you. So
okay.
I think just as long as you speak up.
Okay. So anyway, this table shows the credit that was given highlighted in blue for all tidal shoreline practices. And you can compare that to some of the studies that have shown how much tidal shoreline erosion contributes in the bay. And some of those studies are orders of magnitude greater than the credit, which is highlighted in blue. So that was one of the reasons that this panel was developed, because we thought that this is a significant practice. It substantially reduces more sediment and nutrients. And just to give you an idea of the makeup of our committee, you can see there were representatives from academia, representatives from state, local government, NGOs, and practitioners. So our panel charge was to first define the practice, define the geographical range, conduct literature review, develop specific protocols if warranted, determine qualifying conditions, reporting and verification guidance, and to develop research needs. And this graphic just shows the region of the bay highlighted in lighter green that is affected by these types of practices. So this graphic shows the approval process. The expert panel met for between January 2013 and March 2014, 12 meetings. It was then approved by this source sector work group in April. It went to the Watershed technical work group, which includes all of the Chesapeake Bay modelers. And the Chesapeake Bay modelers said something just doesn't smell right with this protocol. In fact, they were concerned that the credit, the nutrient credit for one of the protocols was far too generous and could potentially result in more nutrient reductions going to the Chesapeake Bay than the model is showing as coming from loadings. So they stripped out the nutrient credit from one of the protocols. Now I'll get into that later, with the understanding that they would do more study and add it back in. Well, they did more study. They adopted or modified a Chesapeake Bay model. And in 2017, they added nutrient credits back in, which was approved, but then they had to go back in 2019 because they made some mathematical mistakes. So, and I'll explain that in more detail. So one of the first things the panel did was to define shoreline management, what we're talking about. And we broke out shoreline management into two categories: living shorelines, which include completely non-structural, and then the hybrid living shorelines, which includes some structure, such as stone sills or breakwater. The other category includes structural, such as bulkheads, revetments, et cetera, et cetera. So the panel was charged to do a comprehensive literature review. Every panel member was assigned a certain group of scientific journals and agrarian scientific literature. And we came up with 4 different protocols for this practice that are associated with unique processes for removing sediment and nutrient. The first of these practices we call it, or protocols, is prevented sediment, and I'll get into these in more detail. The prevented sediment protocol accounts for the reduction in sediment from just the erosion that occurs. And of course, there are nutrients tied up in the sediment. So there is a nutrient credit with this protocol. And this was the protocol I mentioned, where the nutrient credit was stripped out by the modelers because they thought that could blow up the Chesapeake Bay model. The second credit is for tidal marsh denitrification. I think that's pretty obvious. If you create a living shoreline, you can determine the area of your marsh and estimate denitrification rates. And we did literature survey and synthesize what would be the best rates for that. The third protocol is for the sediment trapping through accretion that occurs during tidal events. And again, this protocol accounts for the phosphorus attached to the sediment. The accretion rates or trapping rates are based on literature surveys. And the final credit is it's not a very high credit, but for all of you biologists out there, it's based on the marsh-Redfield ratio, which is, you can Google it, it's kind of interesting. It is a fixed ratio of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in the standing crop of plants. And the expert panel felt that the Redfield ratio within different marsh variants did not vary that much. So we used just an average or mean or geometric mean. I forget which. So this is just a very brief summary. A little bit more detail. The prevented sediment protocol, again, is gives credit to hybrid practices as well as living shoreline practices that reduce sediment. And in order to get the credit, what a lot of jurisdictions have done is that they have monitored the loss rate of the encroachment rate of the or retreat rate of the banks over several years. There are also default rates available from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and VIMS, Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And like I said, the modeling work group initially stripped out the nutrient credit here because they felt it was too generous. but with they have studied it, since studied it, and there's a brand new watershed and bay model, and they made some tweaks to it and added a nutrient credit associated with sediments that are prevented. And again, the initial credit, there were some math errors involved, so that's why it was updated in 2019. Okay, I did, as I said, there is a lookup table which for Maryland and Virginia that will give you the percent sand factor and will give you erosion rates if you don't have those erosion rates. And there was a huge debate with this protocol because a lot of the panel felt that by the tightening of the shoreline, we were in fact preventing sand from eroding, which is good for SAV beds. So in an attempt to disincentivize or at least to account for that, the credit was only given for the fine sediment. And as you can see in the far right corner of this table, there's a sand reduction factor applied to that credit. I'm sorry. Okay, so I was a little taken aback by this hand-drawn example. So tidal marsh denitrification, as I mentioned, is the average denitrification that occurs over the marsh area once you establish a living shoreline. So the denitrification rates came from the literature, and these are simply multiplied times the marsh area. Sediment trapping through accretion. We looked at the data, we looked at the accretion studies, and we developed averages and came up with an average accretion rate and associated phosphorus reduction, which is then multiplied by the surface area of the created marsh. And the marsh Redfield ratio is kind of an interesting credit. It's not very large, but when you have a standing crop of wetland varieties, there is a fixed ratio of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Of course, that ratio varies depending on the diversity and makeup of your community. The expert panels decided to use just an average value and then annualize the loading rate. So you take this annualized loading rate and just multiply times the surface area of your living shoreline. So the expert panel was not very happy when we were told we had to add a default rate for planning purposes for historic projects or projects that were kind of didn't fit into these categories. So the um, default rate is not assumed to be 100%. I'll show you the table that it's based on, but there is a 50% reduction factor, so it's not fully credited. And the default rate is based on this study of sediment sedimentation rates by the Maryland Geological Survey, and of course only finds highlighted in bold black in blue, light blue row. Only defines are what the credit is based on. Then you have, so you would take this rate and then multiply your site average or area, and then you would take the 50% off of that. So I'm using two computers here. My mouse is not working. Very good. Okay, so just a quick summary of the different protocols and submitted units and nitrogen and phosphorus assumptions and total suspended solids assumptions. I wasn't planning on going through all of this today. I'll just leave this with you so you can peruse it for reference. And I should also qualify this in that. So I chaired the initial panel, and then 3 years later, the modelers came out with their adjusted rates, but there really wasn't any quality control going through the document to see what effect that would have. So I picked up a few mistakes, but there might be a couple of math errors in here. And if you come across any, just let me know. I thought this it was important to go over some of the basic qualifying conditions for shoreline management practices. You have for living shoreline non-structural hybrid systems, the following qualifying conditions must be met to receive credit. The site has to currently experience shoreline erosion or replaces armor. The site was graded, vegetated, and sediment removed, and a marsh fringe habitat or beach dune habitat is created or maintained. So those are the very basic qualifications for crediting the living shorelines systems. For revetments and or breakwaters without a living shoreline, the site is has to experience erosion. A living shoreline is not technically feasible or practical, and the footprint of the breakwater would not cover historical SAD or shellfish beds or wetlands. And for bulkheads, again, the site's experiencing shoreline erosion, and the site consists of port facilities, marine facilities, etc., and with depths of 10 to 35 feet. The crediting of structural systems was very controversial, and 40% of the panel opted to, they wrote a letter which was appendicized in this document, voicing their objections to the fact that we were crediting these hardened practices. But it went to the Bay Work Group. It was discussed by the Bay Work Groups, but the Bay Work Groups approved the practice anyway. So again, some of the issues, I think I spoke about this for Protocol 1, was the removal of sand. And I just mentioned projects. A lot of people felt armoring should not receive any credit. And that's why we put the qualifying conditions in the previous tape. So the key issue that for Protocol 1, I call it the Chesapeake Bay model to blow up, what had to do with the concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen that we found in the tidal shoreline sediments were often very high. And when you take those concentrations and convert them to a load in developing a credit, those load reductions far exceeded the load reductions that were being modeled. So what the Chesapeake Bay modeling team did was well, of course, they revised a model, but they looked at the availability, reactivity of phosphorus and nitrogen, and that's how they adjusted those numbers in 2017 and later 2019. Also, in response to some of the issues, state agencies were given quite a bit of flexibility in terms of determining which practices could be credited. The permitting agency, so we didn't want to usurp their authority, and we felt they were the best people to say, no, don't put a practice here, as opposed to putting it in writing. And I mentioned already that Protocol 1 was only initially approved for total suspended sediment. There was also something that's a little out there, but a fine sediment cap based on the sediment transport model, so that if you summed up all of your practices, and I did mention that these practices are additive, can be additive. So if you are working in a segment and you sum up all of these practices, they can't exceed the cap based on the Bay Program sediment transport model. So real quickly, just to give you an example, this is a real example. Came from Baltimore County. Baltimore County identified 3 reaches in Back River. One reach, 1,000 feet or so, had 6 to 8 feet high vertical bank, badly eroding. Trees were falling into the water. It was susceptible to strong winds because of the long fetch. Second reach, a little bit smaller, was broken into 2. 881 feet was the first of the 2, and the third reach included 650 linear feet. The county was had a pretty robust monitoring program, so they measured the bank retreat and took bulk density measurements, so it can be the retreat could be converted into a long-term erosion rate. The erosion rate for the steeper bank was 3 to 5 feet per year. I'm sorry, was 1.5 feet per year, and for the shallower bank, 1 foot per year. So what the county decided to do was to include structural and non-structural practices, which included a living shoreline planted with almost 2 acres of wetland grasses, and that were protected by stone sills just on the edge and breakwaters. And just to give you an idea of okay, this is what the before condition looked like. And the post-constructions up top. And so this table summarizes the results, and it's interesting. If you look at Protocol 1, gives you by far the greatest credit for sediment. But again, you do get appreciable credit for denitrification. And you can see by this column all the way to the right. Oops, sorry. I have trouble with my pointer again. So much for technology. What I was going to say, you can see in this column here that the nutrient credits are stackable among the different types of protocols. So for accountability, the Bay has Bay program has a pretty robust accountability program for all projects to receive credit. The agency needs to supply name, location, permit, number, county, location, practice type, vegetation area. There's an initial performance verification. A responsible party must be identified, and the duration of the credit is 5 years, which can be renewed based on future verification. And I know that the Chesapeake Stormwater Network, I think Tom Schuler was working on much more robust verification guidance. So I could look into that if you're interested. So this is a pretty quick presentation. So sorry you couldn't hear me that well, but are there any questions?
So thank you, Bill, for the presentation. I greatly appreciate taking the time. If any of you have any questions, you can enter it in the chat box and we can address them to the whole group. But question for you, Bill, do you know where our attendees can find the full version of the report? Is there a go-to place to find it?
Yes, and you can find a full, the latest version of the report on the Chesapeake Stormwater Network's webpage.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can find that right now.
I'm not sure if it's up on the Bay Program's website or not. They're not very good about updating. But I just downloaded from the Chesapeake Stormwater Network, Tom Schuler's network.
Okay, I just found it, so I'm going to share it in the chat box for all participants, if you all are interested. Excuse me. So I don't see any questions coming in at this time. I'll give it a minute or two. I have Ariana Richardson saying, very informative, thank you. So like I mentioned before, this webinar series, we try to have one once a month, and the next ones will be posted on the DelawareLivingShorelines.org website. We also have that in-depth training that we still have space available if you are interested in attending, that starts tomorrow. That gets you right into the trenches of how to design a living shoreline. But thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you around next time. And I think with that, if anyone thinks of a question later, Bill's email is on the screen here. Feel free to get in touch with him. I'm speaking for you, Bill. I hope you don't mind.
Sure. I feel like I'm a Maytag repairman as a former chair. Well, anyway, so I'd be happy to respond to any questions. One thing I will mention is that in discussions with Tom Schuler, who heads up, who chairs the Urban Stormwater Work Group, we both recognize that this practice needs to be updated as part of the Chesapeake Bay program's adaptive management process. There has been quite a bit of monitoring of living shorelines since the initial protocols were developed that weren't captured in here. And whether and when that's going to happen, I'm just not sure.
That was actually going to be my next question, so I'm glad you addressed that.
Okay.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and log off of here. Again, thank you all for participating, and have a good afternoon.
Okay, I'll see you.